Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
What's Labour's current relationship like with British business? Is there anyone in the cabinet with any business experience at all? And Reform UK tops the latest City A.M poll as Farage's approval ratings climb. Let's talk about all of this on this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. Alongside me this week, we have TPA researcher Jonathan Eida. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
Good to see you again. Welcome back. This is your second appearance.
Thank you very much
on the
for having
podcast.
me.
You were amazing on the first, so the bar is high. And our guest this week is Alys Denby, opinion and features editor for City A.M. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you in. You've got a sense there. One of the things, or a number of the things I'm keen to talk about. I mean, Alys, first off, let's kick around where we are when it comes to British business. You have your finger on the pulse. You're talking to business leaders in the capital and around the country quite frequently. Where are they at when it comes to their position and how they feel about Labour so far?
Deep frustration, and I think a deep sense of betrayal. And in some sense, the idea that they were duped. I mean, so I think let's go back to before the election. Yeah. Rachel Reeves, we know, was doing the rounds. She was having these smoked salmon breakfasts with businesses. She was really trying to convince them that since Corbyn project, Labour had changed and Labour could now be trusted with the economy. And I think to some extent, businesses were like, OK. But I think to a greater extent, they were extremely frustrated with the Conservatives. And one of the things that Labour touted about how trusted they could be was that they had this letter signed by about 121 business leaders saying, yeah, vote Labour at the next election. Now, actually, if you analysed the signatories, there wasn't a single FTSE 500 leader in there. I mean, that's not unusual. Those guys tend to sort of keep their powder dry a bit. But a lot of them were also declared Labour supporters. So I think it's possible to overstate the extent to which businesses were convinced by Labour ahead of the election.
Yeah.
I think the victory was much more a rejection of the Conservatives. However, after the election, we had Rachel Reeves' budget where she imposed huge taxes on employers at the same time as masses of new regulation around workers' rights. And I think businesses felt extremely betrayed.
Yeah, so you use the word betrayal and betrayed. I prefer the term shafted, if that's all right with everyone here. But it's really interesting. I mean, have they been taken for mugs then, British business?
I mean, some of them will say that in terms. I mean, so City A.M contacted those 120 signatories after the budget. And I think only around 20 were still prepared to say publicly that they stood by what they said. One specifically said in terms that they felt duped. Yeah. Anonymously, I have to say.
I'm interested to know, what were they hoping for? What was the pitch that Rachel Reeves set out to them prior to the election versus like what precisely were they duped about? That seems.
Well, so Rachel Reeves obviously made a big play about securonomics. She said, look, you can we'll be a stable government, we'll be a relief after the chaos of the Tories with constant changes of leadership. And I think businesses just felt, exactly. We all know that one thing that businesses prize above all is certainty. And they're, OK, 5 years of a single government, they'll just get on with things and essentially get off our backs a bit. I think, if they were being honest, they had deep suspicions, justified suspicions that Labour were going to raise taxes. That was what Labour always do. But I'm not sure they were necessarily expecting it to be a tax that was this damaging.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? Because obviously, you have the official relationships and a sense of, officially we're going to support business, you can trust us or whatever. But there's always, you can always pick up the vibes and the back channels. And I mean, I find myself listening to you, Alys, just thinking, you've got all of these business leaders who kind of thought, do you know what, this is going to be all right. And then you have, as you've outlined, you have the budget that Reeves outlined, including the increase in the minimum wage and also the employers' national insurance contributions going up as well. I mean, how far would we go? Would we go so far as to say that actually they were lied to? Or can we have some benefit of the doubt here that once they got into government, Labour went, whoa, we need to find some cash here. And of course, it's always big business that they look to.
I'm not sure I would say they were lied to. I mean, I think if you'd been reading City A.M. ahead of the election, as we all should, you would know that, look, there's only, if they're ruling out the so-called taxes on working people, there's only a few places they are going to turn. So I think that this was predicted. I think where you might say they felt particularly shafted is where you see the kind of attacks on things like private schools, on non-doms, on wealth, which I think betrays Labour's deeper instincts, which are that they are suspicious of business. They don't believe in wealth creators as a force for good. They believe in them as a source of revenue. And that, you're seeing the results of that. You're seeing wealthy non-doms flee the country. You're seeing tax revenues reduce. And I think you just sense in the business community, well, they're not just hitting us with taxes. They're trying to hit us on the things that we like about this country.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also, I mean, we've got to make the observation that a leopard never changes its spots, right? So I live on the south coast of England, and just after the election, actually, last year, I was talking to a chief executive of a business group who represents loads of small businesses on the south coast. I won't name them because I don't have her permission. But what was interesting about it, she said locally, the council in this particular part of the coast recently went from Conservative to Labour. So they started to meet representatives of this new Labour council, and all of these Labour councillors were just kind of like, we're going to do X, we're going to do Y, we're going to do Z, and she was like, well, this is great for our area, how are you going to pay for it? Well, we're looking to business, because obviously, you lot have all the money, quote unquote. And I mean, I was genuinely staggered, because we all know if you run a small business, and here we're talking about shopkeepers, or maybe an industrial unit that employs 6 to 12 people, so we're not talking about big business, and yet that mindset still exists, even at I say still exists, has always existed, but at a very low level, which is, it's all right, big business will pick up the tab.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also worth noting, when it comes to the national insurance rises combined with the workers' rights legislation, it is the smaller businesses that are really paying the price. Bigger businesses, the sort that we talk to a lot in the city, can absorb this stuff. It's your local hairdressers, it's your nurseries, it's the businesses that enliven a high street that are suffering the most.
And we call this podcast a nation of taxpayers, which is based on, I think it was it Napoleon who called us a nation of shopkeepers. Your take on this, Jonathan? I mean, Labour's current dealings with big business, where do you sit with it all?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know one of the big pushes that Labour have been going on is to sort out the regulation and the regulatory landscape within the city, which has been really fascinating. I know that Andy Halliday spoke at the City A.M. award ceremony the other night, and spoke about the calls to slash red tape, and he said they had little chance of success if there aren't mandates in law. I'm interested to see where that actually goes, how effective those are. And how streamlined they can actually make the regulation and the regulatory system. I have my suspicions. I don't think that they will do that. I think that without tackling the main problem, which is remit and general powers, that might that won't actually amount to anything. And I don't really see much evidence of that happening, because that will take a lot of backbone, and I don't think this government will have that. Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think the insight that I have from my position at City A.M. is that we've had the heads of both the FCA and the CMA kind of write for us about how they intend to respond to this growth mandate. And they say, we want to do it, we are very keen, but you get the sense reading between the lines that what they're really looking for here is air cover from the government. And you're right, that is a question of mandate, remit. You can't just say, regulate for growth. It's kind of a contradiction in terms. So I think regulators understand this challenge, but I think they're very keen to warn, look, you need to increase your risk appetite as a government. If we are going to try and boost growth, you're going to have to accept that there's going to be failures along the way. And I think what they really want is more air cover from the government.
I personally don't really see the point of having a regulatory body if you aren't willing to regulate. I don't really see it as you say, as a contradiction in terms, but I don't get how they actually go about that. What's the purpose of the FCA if they aren't regulating? I don't know how exactly are they going to account for this quote unquote secondary growth objective? Well, what does that mean? And I've seen, I know the FCA put forward a policy of naming and shaming companies that were under FCA investigation. And that's a disastrous policy in terms of
They've rolled back on that, haven't they?
They have rolled back on that, but they put it forward in February 2024, which was under the remit of the last government, admittedly. But within that was also, they introduced the secondary growth objective under the last government. Bin Afellami was very keen on the secondary growth objective, but it just goes to show you that words are cheap. It doesn't mean anything. And I think there needs to be much greater progress in reforming the whole regulatory landscape in order to achieve that. So.
What's your take, Alys, on where UK business is now in terms of right here, right now, this Tuesday morning, an SW1 regarding, you're sitting around a boardroom table and you're thinking, right, we need to at least have a sense of where we're going in the next 3 years. What's the kind of mood?
I mean, so as you say, we had our City A.M. awards last week. The amount of talent and ambition in that room, people there who really want Britain to succeed, who want to create jobs, who want to create better lives for people. That is all still there. That hunger is still there. But I think there's just this deep malaise. And it's not, to be fair, look, it's not just Britain, it's global. Huge global uncertainty, Trump, war, whatever. And let's not forget, lots of the biggest wealth creators have left this country now.
Why would you stay?
Why? And that is in itself a disaster for business. And also, it's not just people who are already sort of at the top of the tree. Young people are leaving. The number of young people going to the UAE or what have you, for a better life.
So do you get a sense from when you talk to these people at your awards ceremony and indeed elsewhere, do you get a sense of what they actually need to see, or what practically can be done for them to almost see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel?
I mean, obviously this Nix policy is disastrous. I think Rachel Reeves, I think she should go. I've said that in City A.M. I think she sort of boxed herself into a corner through political miscalculations. And I think that, that's her fault.
You have said that. I think you're right. But do you think Starmer would have the balls to do it?
I think it's very difficult because she's so central to his economic agenda. But look, I think she made terrible political misjudgments. I don't think she's got good antenna. And I think what business needs, and what it has always needed, and what it also didn't have under the Conservative government, was a sense of a country that valued them, that encouraged risk-taking and entrepreneurship, but also admired people who do that. In this country, we have this kind of long-standing, I think, snobbery and suspicion of ambition, of getting above your station. And I think part of it is a kind of structural thing so in America, obviously, it's much easier to start, but it's got this entrepreneurial buccaneering spirit, whereas in Britain, I think, you can have quite an easy life if you just sort of...
I'm so glad you said that, because I picked up on it. I've got a mate who is no longer doing it, but several years ago, he decided to buy a pub, all right? And tried to successfully run a pub business. Again, this is in the West Sussex countryside, glorious, South Downs in the distance, and all of this. And it was really interesting to look at people's reaction to his decision to do this. Instead of going, mate, great opportunity, wishing you all the best. I wouldn't do that. I mean, the hospitality sector is really, really hard. Now, some of these observations may have come from a good place, and we know that hospitality is been through the mill recently. But you're absolutely spot on, Alys, because the default setting was just like, what are you doing that for? As opposed to like, that's a great idea. Good luck to you. Where does that come from then?
Well, do you know what? I do think it's partly structural. I think it's partly because one of our biggest exports is obviously services. And I think if you just sort of go to university and get a job at a law firm, you can have quite a nice life. So I think there's too much of a comfort blanket. I mean, that's obviously an extremely middle class perspective.
Well, let's give a slightly different view. You can go into the public sector and have a relatively well paid job. I was just thinking, do I need to choose my words carefully? No. Not have to work too hard, swing the lead a little bit, and actually have a relatively comfortable life but not a great deal of responsibility.
I think it's partly, as I say, I think it's partly because we're still quite a class-bound country. So I think there's part of that. But I also think that, it also comes from government policy. It also comes from being so heavily taxed.
Yeah.
And I think the pandemic has a lot to do with our attitude to risk. I think it really reset people's relationship with the state and gave them the idea that it was the government's job to take risk away from their lives.
And look after them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think fundamentally businesses need yes men to succeed and women to succeed, but bureaucracies are full of no men, and that's what the civil service is. That's what the regulatory environment encourages. It's people saying, no, we can't do this, you have to be careful of this, and that drains away the risk appetite. And in order to get that back, you actually need to step back. The government needs to step back and stay away from business and let them do their job.
That's a really good line. Did you come up with that, or have you nicked it from someone?
I've came up with it myself.
It's full of no men and women. Is that what you said?
Well, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, it's good.
I think it sums it up. And let's just extend this conversation a little bit before we look at Reform UK and their rise in the polls, particularly the latest City A.M. poll. When it comes to this cabinet, and I've had a delve around, I suspect you have because it's your job as well, I can't find a shred of evidence to suggest that there's anyone in that cabinet who has ever run a business.
No.
In the private sector. They might have looked after budgets, but there'll be budgets that will be funded by our money, not their own money, right? So you have a slightly different laissez-faire attitude. Oh, we run over budget. Okay, we'll just get some more cash in or raise the taxes. But in terms of the cabinet, I see no one in there who's got any understanding or a working knowledge of the private sector and business.
No, I mean, to be fair, Rachel Reeves has some private sector experience, but it's unclear
We don't know
it is.
what's the current version this week?
Yeah, exactly.
Was it customer services or accounts? I've lost track of it,
Who
really.
knows?
Yes, I think it was customer services, wasn't it? Complaints handling.
Yeah.
Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, what's he ever run?
Well, I don't think he's ever had a proper job.
Is he trade unionist?
Well, yeah, some people listening might conclude that's a proper job. But he was the fellow where he claimed to be a solicitor and has now had to row back on it, hasn't he?
Yes, no, that's right.
Because he was a trainee.
He was a trainee for about 6 months and then became a Labour MP, I believe.
Do we think then the fact that there's no business experience in the cabinet, is that partly responsible for shaping where this government is when it comes to their relationship with British business?
Yeah, of course, because we know that a Labour government's constituency is always the public sector and the trade unions.
Yeah.
Of course it is, because those are its paymasters.
Yeah.
They fling this accusation at the Tories that you're in the pocket of big business. Well,
I know.
Maybe they should be. Which is better? No, they don't have any business experience. And I also think, again, it goes back to this question of valuing entrepreneurs. When someone like Rishi Sunak or Sajid Javid give up multi-million pound careers to go into public services, what do they get? Just attacked for it.
Yeah. Well, that gets us into the whole area about, and we've talked about it before on this podcast, that whether or not we need to look seriously at increasing the amount of money you pay MPs so you get better talent in Parliament who have experience of the private sector, because actually I think most sane people now, if your politics are right of centre and you're thinking of going into politics and you're a chief executive of a very well-respected business or a small business or whatever, are you seriously going to take a pay cut and also put up with all of the flack that you would get for being an MP?
Well, plenty of people do. Plenty of people in business have that deep sense of public service and wanting to give something back to their country. That's why a lot of them started businesses in the first place. Yeah. But as you say, when they do, all they get is abuse.
Let's talk about Reform UK for a bit, because the latest City A.M. polling has got some great numbers here in terms of where our various political leaders are sitting and also voting intention as well. So the usual caveats apply. It's one poll, and we're 4.5 years away, or just over 4 years away potentially from another general election, but anything can happen. So the approval ratings in terms of political leaders, you have Starmer on -36, you got Kemi on -15 and Farage on -8. So by my reckoning, and having read the report today, Farage has managed to reduce his negativity in the eyes of voters. And in terms of voting intention across the country, you've got Reform sitting on 32%, Labour 22%, Conservatives 19%, and the Lib Dems 15%. Jonathan, I'll just go to you first. What's your kind of take on those numbers?
Yeah, it shows Reform doing well. Whether this is the crest of a wave, I'm not sure. Whether they'll keep this up, I'm not sure. We'll see if they can run their councils well, whether that boosts or decreases their chances of winning the next election. But it's fascinating to see where they go. I don't think at the moment they've got the most coherent policy platform. I would like to shy away more from some of their views on nationalisation, for example, or higher taxes on solar farms, which I know you're keen on. But yeah, we'll see where it goes.
We'll get into some of the policy stuff in a second. I mean, Alys, this rise of Reform is fascinating to watch, and it has been over the last few months. What's your take on where Farage is at the moment?
Yeah, I think this definitely shows that Reform are a serious force to be reckoned with. I think it's interesting that you say Farage because, of course, it is very much a sort of one-man band.
I do that on purpose. I have made the argument elsewhere in print and elsewhere in the media. I mean, I use the term Nigel Farage's Reform UK Party because that is a strength, but it's also a massive weakness.
And I think it's also worth remembering that when we see, Farage is outpolling Kemi Badenoch, well, the public have known Farage for decades, whereas she's very new on the scene. Yeah,
and she's not been in the jungle either.
No, exactly. So I think a lot of this has to do with the clear talent and charisma of Farage himself. I do think when it comes up to the general election, people will be looking more across the board. They'll be looking at how these councils have performed in their local area. They'll be looking at the candidates. Reform and UKIP and Brexit Party before them have had serious problems with the kind of candidates they attract. And they will be giving Kemi if she's still in place by the next election.
Oh, hang on, make a note to talk about that in a second. Yeah,
a much a bigger hearing towards the next election. I mean, we were talking about when Rachel Reeves was going around. I mean, going around businesses ahead of the last election. This was kind of 2 years that nobody knew who she was before that, right? So she took her 2 years. Yeah. So I would say Kemi does have some time.
You think she's still got time?
I think she has time to convince the general public. I think her problem is that she hasn't managed quite to stamp her authority on the party. That's the risk, and the risk is that her MPs decide to roll the dice on someone else. I think the general public don't care what she says one way or another, but they will in 2 years' time.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting take, and I find myself now doubting the position I had before we started recording, which was they've dipped below 20% the Conservatives in quite a few polls recently, and for me that puts them towards relevance territory. And a couple of weeks ago, I would have said, don't change your leader again because you're just going to look more incompetent than people already think you are, right? Which is why you got a massive drubbing last year. However, I was leaning towards this idea that maybe they need to have a last roll of the dice and change leader. But you're quite persuasive in your argument there, Alys, that actually, the closer we come to an election, people will want to hear from the leader of the Conservatives, and that could well still be Kemi Badenoch.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't speculate one way or another on Kemi's future. It's clear that there is discontent within the party. We've had
but they are their own worst enemies, though, aren't they?
Absolutely are.
I mean, I love some of the stuff that. Well, he campaigned as Bobby J, didn't he? Robert Jenrick to be leader. I saw the baseball caps that he was selling. I love some of his social media stuff he's doing at the moment. He's really slick with these videos, and that's the stuff that Kemi should be doing. But you look at that and you just go, oh, mate, come on, this is a little bit too obvious.
It's very obvious, yeah.
I mean, do you think they should change their leader?
No, I don't really see much point. I think that'll be a scalping for Nigel Farage. He'll say, I decapitated a Tory leader because of me. But the problem they've all got, and it won't really change, is that Nigel Farage sucks all the air out of the room on the right. I don't know who challenges him. Like it's a bit like when you had all the Republican candidates standing against Donald Trump. It's kind of like Donald Trump takes all the attention.
Actually. Yeah.
And you need to outdo him somehow, but without being identical to him, because otherwise you might as well vote for him. So
the Tories and Labour then, on that basis, are just putting their faith in the fact that Reform somehow will implode inside the next few years and start to unravel.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's good. When you mentioned Donald Trump, I mean, Donald Trump has clearly created a sort of cult of personality around him. People like Marco Rubio and JD Vance, who were once very opposed to him, have now been kind of sucked into his orbit, as you say. Reform still has this problem that nobody can get on with Nigel Farage. It managed to have a rebellion when it had just 5 MPs. So, I think there's still a strong chance that it does.
Do you think ultimately that's going to be the thing that brings the party down? Because it's this interesting situation where everyone knows Nigel Farage, right? And they know him by his last name is Farage, right? It's the same as the Boris thing, isn't it? You've got that going on. That is a strength. However, for that party to grow, you need other, I think the phrase is tall poppies, don't you? And you're right. If you read Michael Crick's book about Nigel Farage, throughout all of the chapters, it's littered with the bodies of people who he's fallen out with. So he's in this really interesting position where, in order for the party to grow and to get into government, he needs more people. But his track record to date suggests he doesn't want to share his toys.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to mention the Michael Crick book as well, which I recently read. It's really great. I recommend it to all your readers. Extremely entertaining. But you're right, it paints a portrait of an impossible man, extremely talented, generational political talent, but not someone who can bring a team along with him. And someone who, and if you command, the difference between Reform and the Conservatives is that Reform commands personal loyalty to Farage, whereas the Conservative parties have centuries of history to an idea.
Yeah. Yes.
And to a winning party. So I think ultimately, this may be, wishful thinking or motivated reasoning, but I think ultimately the Conservatives will still attract people who care about the ideas and who care about the right rather than just care about Farage.
Yeah, but in terms of the next election, though, I'm not sure how much it matters, like any of this really, because because people will vote for Nigel, and he is the figurehead. We saw, personally, I was quite enjoying what Rupert Lowe was doing in Parliament. I don't think anyone had an output like Rupert Lowe, and yet he's now gone. But yet people still voted for Reform in the council election. So I just wonder what happens at the end of this, basically, because I just think people will still gravitate to Reform and Farage.
And just a final few moments on, as we talk about this kind of, I suppose, personality politics. And you're right. I mean, the Crick book does go from UKIP through the Brexit Party and where we are currently with Reform. Do you not think Nigel Farage has learned his lesson by now? That, having gone through those parties and people who the bodies, the carcasses littered on the sidelines, that actually, in order to have a real punt at getting power, he's going to have to give a bit of slack and allow other people to share the limelight.
I mean, look, Reform is clearly a more professional operation and a more powerful electoral force, I guess, depending on how you look at it, because obviously it was UKIP who won the referendum, but Reform now seems to be heading more towards general election success. And of course, they've got more MPs than UKIP ever had. So, yes, look, it does seem like a more professional operation, but it is still a one-man band.
Yeah, and it's 5 MPs, and this idea that they're now the official opposition is for the birds, isn't it? Because the Tories have 121, isn't it? I think so. Yeah, it's an interesting one. It'll be interesting to see what happens and what they do next. Really, either the Conservatives or Labour to try and take Farage out, because that's what they're going to have to do in some capacity. Let's just talk about the policies, or potentially the lack of policies when it comes to Reform, or indeed maybe let's say something to voters in the north, but possibly say something different to voters in the south. Jonathan, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, it's definitely quite muddled. I think the perhaps you can say the strain throughout is this idea of the nation state and the national identity, combined probably with woke politics. I think the taxes on solar farms is a backlash against the woke agenda, the green agenda, which is what it is. But I don't think they should be doing that. To be quite frank,
well, let's just recall what they triumphed, didn't they? Reform UK will scrap net zero was the headline. Windfall tax on renewable generated power. A solar farm tax on farmers taking the renewable subsidy. Ban on battery energy storage systems, known as BESS, legislate to force National Grid to put cables underground. For some people in the South, maybe, who warm towards the old days of Margaret Thatcher and the kind of Thatcherite policies, low tax, etc., minimal state intervention, i.e. don't ban things, you'd look at that and just go, whoa, what's happening?
I think, again, this is another a sort of sign of Reform's deeper problem, because as far as I know, this was just Richard Tice freelancing. And I think they rode back back on it. It was just some tweet that Richard Tice put out, and I have no idea how much approval.
Well, there's a
it
picture
went
of him
through.
there, and there's also Nigel in the background.
Oh,
So
Nigel's kind of blurred out.
I think most people would think that's got to be reform policy, right?
Official.
I feel like they've rode back on that. I mean, look, I think Nigel Farage and Richard Tice's instincts are Thatcherite. See, some of the policies they had in their general election manifesto, which the City A.M poll finds are individually very popular. So cutting income tax, 50% support, cutting stamp duty, 40% positive, cutting inheritance tax, 45% positive, cutting corporation tax, 23% positive. That's a very Thatcherite agenda.
Yeah.
The problem is that the IFS analysed Reform's general election manifesto and said, look, your sums just don't add up.
Yeah.
Your public spending cuts are not going to pay for your tax cuts. So, and again, this is a manifesto that Reform seem to have, completely abandoned, or not. They're not talking. I mean, are they talking about cutting corporation tax and inheritance tax now? I don't think so. So who knows what they stand for economically?
Yeah.
I mean, they have to say they want to renationalise steel. That's not Thatcherite at all.
No, it's not. And I mean, you can make the argument that we're so far away from a general election, they don't need to really worry about it. But you can also make the argument, which is, if you want to burst through that 30% when it comes to polling and maintain a lead that gives you a solid majority, there are voters still waiting to find out what Reform actually stand for.
No, it's very true. But does it matter how? No, but seriously, does it matter to voters? Though,
I've got to say this, John. I've got to
make
make this observation throughout this podcast. And it's not a criticism; it's an observation. Very laissez-faire. Doesn't matter. They're going to vote for Nigel anyway.
No, but seriously though, will it matter? Will it matter to people if their policy platform is muddled? Because it depends what the main issue of the day is. I mean, if you think that immigration is far more important than the nationalisation of steel,
it trumps everything. Doesn't it?
Trumps everything.
Yeah, you're right.
So I don't know. It could be to garner a few votes. So does it make sense? No, I don't.
No. I think you're right to make that point. Listen, we're almost out of time. Is there anything else we need to cover on this podcast? I think we've done Labour's relationship with business. We've had a bit of a pop at the cabinet and the lack of business experience. We talked at length about Reform, a little bit of Tory chat there. What's going on in the world of City A.M. we need to share with people?
I think my favourite story of this morning, I'm sorry, this isn't quite, well, it is a City A.M. story, but it's that Ed Miliband's wife has objected to a development proposal on her own street.
Excellent.
Because it's bulky and doesn't go with the Victorian architecture of North London. And I think this is just absolutely classic NIMBYism of exactly the sort that Labour is trying to demolish. Something that City A.M. has long called for.
Yes.
Particularly in London. Particularly we need densification of central London. So I just think it's very funny, and I think it's just a sign of the real challenge of getting the houses we need in London built when Cabinet Minister's own wife doesn't want new flats on her nice Victorian street.
Dare I say it, though, there's an element when it comes to the Milibands and hypocrisy, because you've got old mad Ed who's banging on about net zero, which some might say is going to bankrupt us all, and yet he's one of the cabinet ministers taking the most flights around the world at the moment. So, maybe it runs in the household. Who knows? Jonathan, thank you for your time. Great having you on the podcast. Alys Denby, opinion and features editor, City A.M. Thank you for coming in. Will you come in on a future episode?
Absolutely. I'll come anytime.
Always go and get your copies of City A.M. Across the capital, and wherever you might be listening to this podcast, go to the website, read some cracking opinion pieces, and sign up to the various newsletters and alerts. Right, thank you for listening to this particular episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. Just a reminder, we have a cracking archive that's in existence featuring various guests over the last several months, including chats with Conservative MP Esther McVeigh, former cabinet member and associate and a fan of Margaret Thatcher, John Redwood. A great conversation with him. And also Rupert Lowe MP, who at the time was a Reform MP, but of course no longer is a Reform MP, sits as an independent. All of those people and more in our archive. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to send an email about anything you've heard, you can email us. It's podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.